Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this second dialogue of Science and Wisdom Live. I am Marco Colnaghi.
And my name is Saida van der Leeuw.
And together we manage Science and Wisdom Live, a project of Jamyang Buddhist Centre, London, whose main aim is to promote the dialogue between researchers in the many fields of science and experienced meditators from different contemplative traditions. And since we really like challenges, tonight we're going to explore a very fundamental question, one that scientists, mystics, and philosophers have asked time and time again throughout human history. What is the fundamental nature of reality? Is the world the way we experience it in our everyday life, or is there a deeper level which is hidden from our habitual sensory perception? And both modern science and the ancient wisdom of contemplative traditions tell us that our idea of the world as composed of many separate entities independent from us as observers might not be a completely accurate description of reality, and that there is a more fundamental level which is accessible through scientific or contemplative inquiry.
And it's my honor to introduce our guests of tonight, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake and Geshe Tenzin Namdak. So starting with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who is a biologist and author of 90 technical papers and 8 books, and also the co-author of 6 books. Dr. Sheldrake studied natural sciences at Cambridge University and also philosophy at Harvard University. And as a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, he was director of studies in cell biology and was also a research fellow of the Royal Society. He worked in India as a principal plant physiologist and also lived for 2 years in the Benedictine ashram of Father Bede Griffiths in Tamil Nadu. From 2005 to 2010, he was director of the Parrot Project, funded from Trinity College in Cambridge. And he's currently a fellow of the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California and of Schumacher's College in Dartington, England. And then Geshe Tenzin Namdak first worked as an environmental researcher. He took ordination as a Buddhist monk from His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1993, before studying Buddhist philosophy and psychology at Sera Jey Monastic University in South India in 1997. He was the first Westerner to complete the 20-year Geshe program at Sera Jey and the Vajrayana study program at Gyume Tantric College. Because of his deep interest in science and as a member of Sera Jey's education department, he organized and took part in numerous dialogues and conferences on contemporary science and contemplative wisdom. Currently, he is the resident teacher at Jamyang Buddhist Centre, London, and teaches worldwide. And finally, we're also honored to have Scott Snibby with us again tonight, who is a visual artist, entrepreneur, and executive director of the podcast A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. And Scott has kindly agreed to moderate the dialogue of tonight again. So over to you, Scott, and many thanks to the speakers for tonight.
Sure. Well, thanks again for inviting me to moderate this. These are my 2 favorite topics of Buddhism and science. So it's incredible to have 2 great experts talking today. We're going to start out by asking each of you, Dr. Sheldrake and Geshe Namdak, to give us, and this sounds a little amusing, I think, the question, to give us a short introduction to your thinking on the nature of reality, both from the scientific perspective and, of course, from the Buddhist perspective, and then go into an open dialogue about the topic, which can go into much more depth. So, Dr. Sheldrake, since you're a guest who's never been with us before, we'd love to start with you.
All right, the nature of reality in 5 minutes. I'm not used to this challenge, except when I lived in India. When I went on train journeys in India, I often went on long train journeys, and on the journeys, as I sat there in this compartment, someone would open a conversation and they'd say, "What is your name? What is your native place? Are you married? How many brothers and sisters? How much do you earn?" They always ask that. And then when he got through all those basic things, they say, "What is your view of the nature of reality?" And I had long journeys on Indian trains discussing the nature of reality. This is, I think, the first time since Indian Railways that I've been asked this question. I don't claim to represent either orthodox science or orthodox religion. I was, in my own personal spiritual history, was Christian background, long atheist phase, indoctrinated into atheist materialism with my scientific education, discovery of the importance of consciousness through psychedelics originally, then meditation in the Hindu tradition and yoga, and then I worked in India and I was very interested in Hindu philosophy. I was drawn back to a Christian path, and I'm now a practicing Christian, an Anglican. So my own views of reality are shaped both by science and by Indian philosophy and by the Christian tradition. And so I can't claim to be speaking for a position that's a standard position, that would be the standard scientific or standard Christian or standard Indian position. Starting with the scientific view, what modern science has done is shown that the visible kind of reality we experience through our senses is in fact pervaded by many invisible connections. In fact, Isaac Newton in the 17th century, when modern science really began through the scientific revolution of the 17th century, came up with a vision of universal interconnectedness in his theory of gravitation, that every particle of matter in the universe attracts every other particle of matter. The whole of nature is interrelated by invisible interconnections. And we now call those the gravitational field, which links together everything in the universe. In the 19th century, Michael Faraday first discovered or named the electrical and magnetic fields, and we now think of the whole universe as filled with the electromagnetic field through which light travels, and not just visible light, but invisible light, in the form of X-rays, cosmic rays, and so forth. Ultraviolet, so lots of invisible forms of light. And then through quantum theory we have the idea that there are matter fields underlying the very nature of matter, and the matter we experience as hard and impenetrable is actually made up of vibratory patterns of activity within fields. Modern science, even conventional modern science, doesn't give us a view of reality being what it seems to be to the senses. There's a great deal of interconnectedness. In many ways one could say that modern science is in the business of explaining the visible in terms of the invisible. And the other great vision of modern science is that the universe is evolutionary, not just life on Earth, not just human culture, but the entire universe, starting with the Big Bang, has been expanding, cooling down, and evolving so that more and more form, structure, order, pattern come into being in a creative universe. So if one then says, well, in this scientific worldview, what are the most fundamental realities? In the 19th century, people would have answered matter as the most fundamental reality, and that was the basis of the philosophy of materialism, which says matter is the only reality and mind is derived from matter in the brain. But in modern science, the answer to that question is fields and energy. Fields are what shape and structure everything. The sun is round because of the gravitational field. The fields are what shape the natural order, and energy is what gives it actuality, movement, change. Energy is what underlies the development of nature. It underlies matter itself. As David Bohm said, in the light of modern physics, matter is regarded as frozen light, that it's light energy bound in fields, vibrating to give us matter as we know it. Now, the big thing that's left out of this scientific picture is, of course, consciousness. And for materialists, that is the hard problem. It's called the hard problem, because if you say that reality consists of unconscious matter and that's all there is, then how do you explain the fact that humans are conscious? Well, you can't, and that's why it's called the hard problem. So within science recently, there's been a move within philosophy of mind and indeed in neuroscience towards a more panpsychist view of nature, saying that maybe there's some kind of consciousness even in electrons and atoms, and that consciousness in human brains emerges from less complex organized systems. But consciousness pervades all matter, all the universe. Now, that is an increasingly popular view, and but it still sees consciousness as sort of emerging from complexities of matter. And it doesn't explain how the universe came into being in the first place, nor does it explain the creativity within the universe, nor does it explain the source of forms and matter and energy. Now, I myself, as a Christian, see the ultimate reality as the Holy Trinity. The ultimate reality, or God in the Christian version, is not an undifferentiated blob, certainly not an old man sitting on a cloud, but rather an organic combination of a ground of consciousness. God the Father is rather right like the Hindu view of Sat, Chit, Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. God the Father is like Sat in the Hindu model, the ground of conscious being. And when God first announces himself to Moses in the Old Testament, and Moses says, "What is your name?" he says, "I am who I am," or "I am that I am." A statement that God's nature is of conscious being in the present. I am. Then the second aspect of God is the Logos in the Christian Trinity, which Hindus would call names and forms, nama rupa. It's all the forms of things in nature, that which can be known. God the Father is the knower. The Logos, or the Son aspect of the divine, is the known. And to have, you have consciousness which has this division within it of the knower and the known. And both of these are aspects of the divine. Both of them are aspects of God. It's not as if God the Father, the knower, is God and everything else isn't God. No, God the known, that the names and forms in nature are a reflection of this inherent principle of names and forms, or logos, within the divine. But that by itself would be static. And the Holy Spirit, which is the dynamical principle in the Holy Trinity, breath, wind, or energy, is the moving principle which gives actuality and activity to things. So everything in nature, both according to Christian theology and according to modern science, is made up of matter, is made up of energy and form, or energy and fields. Our bodies are shaped by the fields that shape living organisms. They're powered by the energy that flows through them and the breath with which we speak. So everything in nature has energy and form. An atom has energy, which gives it its actuality, and form, which gives it the quantum particles, the neutrons, the protons, the electronic orbitals around it. It's a structure of activity. The form is the structure, the activity is the energy. So I myself see all these aspects of nature as reflections of the Holy Trinity, the ultimate principle which underlies all nature and the evolution of the cosmos. So there you have it. That's perhaps somewhat longer than 5 minutes, but it's as short a summary as I can give.
Yeah, thank you. And Geshe-la, if you'd like to start with the Buddhist view on the nature of reality.
Yeah, so a similar problem will appear that what we study in the traditional way, in order to get a little bit idea of reality, we study for 2 decades, 6 days a week, and quite intense. If I compare to my university studies in the Netherlands, studying hydrology, then studying hydrology was kind of a holiday compared to what we've done in the monastery. So is to summarize it all in 5 minutes also is not an easy task. And also I was in South India and studying this kind of aspects of reality, so to say, and different schools of Buddhist thought and different interpretations that are possible. So you can imagine this as a quite an in-depth kind of research. Yeah, that's not only what has been said in the different schools of Buddhist thought, but also we use logic and reasoning and the form of the language of epistemology. So it's a quite different approach to reality compared to the science we used to study at university, and especially when I came from a background of hydrology, because then the language to describe a particular phenomena is mathematics and statistics, right? And we also had one very interesting subject, and it was the philosophy of mathematics. What can you and cannot prove, and to which extent is what you prove the reality or an approximation of the reality? So that was very interesting. At that time already, I had quite some interest in these aspects of reality. So then, yeah, as you can see, I changed my life a little bit. So that means that there's also not many people in the Netherlands who shave their head and walk around in robes and spend like half the lifetime in South India. So yeah, that's a little bit of my background. And then coming back to the few minutes I've left to describe reality, and then it's also not an easy task. But yeah, let's give it a try. So generally speaking, we have 2 types of truth, or we say we have 2 truths. That means there's a conventional truth and an ultimate truth. And it's not that they're 2 completely different entities or different natures, they also interact with each other. So what is this ultimate truth? This ultimate truth means that nothing exists from its own side. It has what we call an absence or a lack of inherent existence. So inherent existence means thinking that things exist without dependence, right? So if you go back to quantum mechanics or the interpretations of relativity, then we come to the conclusion that the correlation between the individual parts is more important than the individual parts. Yeah, it's a kind of a process. Also, one of my favorite philosophers and mathematicians of the past is Albert Whitehead, who had a very interesting kind of relationship between these aspects of reality, yeah? About the relativity between the different parts being more important. So that means that proves that nothing can exist from its own side. Nothing is independent. Nothing is and that also David Bohm comes to the conclusion of wholeness, that this fragmentation is a problem. Yeah, if we see things as an individual level and try to understand the complete process, that becomes very difficult. So that means if we see things as individual existence or without dependence, that is not reality. And that's then we say the ultimate nature of everything is being empty of this or lacking this or have the absence of these concrete aspects of reality that we think it appears like that. And whatever appears, as we know, is not reality. Yeah. So that's kind of the ultimate nature of reality. And that is then proven by a conventional aspect of reality to different levels. Yeah, we have cause and effect relationships, which actually prove that there is nothing that can exist from its own side. Yeah, as we refute in the ultimate nature of reality. And not only everything is in causal and effect relationships, it's kind of a process, so to say, but also there's an interdependence among parts and a collection of parts. Yeah, so that means there is no from its own side existing kind of a table or a computer or whatsoever. It's made up out of parts, and those parts only function because there's a correlation between the parts. So that's kind of the second level of interdependence. And then the third level of interdependence is kind of a quite more difficult one to be understood, because it talks about things are just merely imputed by the mind. Yeah, what we call a table, what we call Tenzin Namdak, is just, Tenzin Namdak is just merely an imputation based on body and mind. Yeah, within the continuity of this particular person. So that's a kind of 3 levels, so to say, of interdependence. Yeah, so that gives an idea what is reality. Then with regard to consciousness, how does it relate to consciousness? Also there we can see that as just been indicated that we've just been talked about the visible and the invisible, so to say, right? As Dr. Sheldrake indicated those 2 distinctions. So also in that regards, we have also kind of manifest phenomena. Yeah, phenomena we can see like objects that appears to our eye consciousness, for example. Yeah, this manifest. But there are also hidden phenomena in the sense they are hidden from sensory perception, meaning we cannot perceive them with our 5 sensory perceptions. The only way to get an idea of that reality is by the thought process, means kind of mental consciousness, as we define it, that is a conceptual consciousness in the form of thinking and reasoning, and using the language of epistemology, for example. And that has also 2 levels of kind of what we call the hidden phenomena. For example, if we go to our computer screen, then that has manifest aspects, right? The color, the shape is kind of manifest. We perceive with our eye consciousness. But the computer also has hidden aspects. For example, its impermanent nature, that it's momentary changing, right? So the computer has that quality as well. And that we cannot perceive without sensory perception. We can only reason it by the power of reasoning. Yeah? That it is momentary changing because it comes into being at one particular time, and it disintegrates and breaks down over time. And to break down doesn't happen overnight. It happens from the time it comes into being, there's disintegration. And this disintegration moves all the way up to infinite periods of time. So if we talk about disintegration with regards with the Big Bang, as Dr. Sheldrake also just indicated, as certain scientists think that's the start of the universe, but it's more or less a big bounce, right? It means that there's a stream of disintegration of previous forms of matter before the Big Bang came into being. Yeah, so that's kind of things of reality that are not visible. Yeah? Things of reality that can only be found by the power of reason and epistemology at the present time. Yeah, with empirical kind of research at the moment we are limited, and we know that, and that also will develop. Yeah, so, and that is especially in regards what we call the very hidden phenomena that we cannot reason even. For example, we here together meeting on this Zoom event, and this very interesting dialogue, when in each of us created at one particular time, created a kind of idea, oh, let's go to this conference, or let's go to this dialogue, right? So when and where was the first initial kind of thought that came to mind, and how was that thought formed? That thought also doesn't come spontaneous randomly by itself. That is formed by previous moments of consciousness, having some interest in philosophy, having some interest in science, and also those moments of consciousness are preceded by previous moments of consciousness of other thought processes. So to say, each of us, it's not that black and white. For you, it's like this. For another person, it's like that. So that's a kind of a very hidden phenomenon, but it is reality. But it's hidden for us, our sensory perception, as well as for our kind of way of logic, whatever we can use, or even in empirical forms of research. It will be very difficult to pinpoint the initial point of our thought process regarding our interest in this field. Yeah, so that's, yeah, a little bit in short. It's also probably a little bit more than 5 minutes, but that's the best I can do. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That was wonderfully clear. And actually, I think that I too am interested in the philosophy of Whitehead and the process view. And I actually think that almost everything you said is borne out by modern science. I don't see any conflict between it and the scientific, the more sophisticated science we have today than 19th century materialism. I mean, the idea of interrelatedness of everything is part of a scientific worldview. The idea of a series or stream of causes, that nothing just starts from nothing, there's a continuity. I mean, all these things are very much part of the scientific worldview, and the interdependence and interconnectedness. Of course, the scientific assumption that the universe comes into being with no cause in the first place is a philosophical assumption. It's not actually proved by science. And so it's not, although it's part of the scientific worldview, I would say, a naive assumption. And when scientists think about that, well, they don't think about it really. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the laws of nature and all the matter and energy in the universe from nothing in a single instant. So that is, personally, I think the Big Bang speculation or assumption is questionable and arguable, but I don't bother arguing about it very much with my scientific colleagues because it's entirely in the realm of speculation. There were no scientists around at the time of the Big Bang observing it, and if they had been around, they would have evaporated very rapidly since it was millions of degrees centigrade. So all we can do is speculate that scientists speculate that the Big Bang happened. The universe is expanding now. As far as we know, it's always been expanding. So if you just turn the clock back, wind it all back, then it gets smaller and smaller till you reach an initial singularity where all the laws of nature as we know them break down. And basically that's the Big Bang theory. It's an assumption. As you say, if you apply a principle of standard scientific assumptions of continuity, then you come to the conclusion there was a previous universe and this is a big bounce. But again, that's speculative as well. I mean, it's more logical than the scientific, normal standard scientific view. But it takes us into realms of untestable speculation. So I'm not sure, I don't think it helps us very much. I think the biggest point of divergence between modern science and the Buddhist views, as far as I know about them, and I know a little bit about them because my wife is a Dzogchen practitioner, and our house is full of thangkas and statues of Buddhas and green Tara and that sort of thing. So I live surrounded by Buddhist decorative arts, but obviously, when it comes to consciousness, consciousness studies in modern science is a relatively modern area of science. Consciousness was more or less ignored until about 20 or 30 years ago within science. They proceeded as if it didn't exist, and that scientists were somehow able to do all this science being conscious beings, but somehow that was left out of the whole picture. Whereas, obviously, the Buddhist approach has been to concentrate on the nature of the mind and the nature of consciousness from studying it from within with a far greater intensity and over far longer periods than anyone in science. So I would say that by far the greatest strength of the Buddhist approach is this understanding of consciousness from within. And I think that's why many scientists who've been, well, not many, but some have been meeting regularly with the Dalai Lama, and there have been a whole series of discussions on science and consciousness. But I think as I see it, from the biggest problem from the Buddhist point of view is its greatest strength is this understanding of consciousness from within. But not necessarily a problem, but then that's been the focus of most of the attention. But then if you want to understand the nature of a plant and how a leaf of a plant develops, I started as a botanist, and I'm currently writing a paper on the development of plant leaves and the veins in plant leaves and how different plant leaves have different shapes. Then the study of human consciousness doesn't shed much light, as far as I can tell, on the study of plant veins in plant leaves, or the structure of crystals, or many of the phenomena that natural science studies. And I'd be very interested to know how you see a bridge between these areas, since you, like me, share a scientific background.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, as you indicate, it's kind of the main emphasis of Buddhism is consciousness, because the Buddhas Buddha's main motivation was to eliminate suffering, right? So then, because of that, the main aspect of consciousness has been explained in great detail, as you indicated also. But in one aspect, also the matter or plants or whatever you call it outside, and how that is formed and how it initially is formed and what is the process behind it, it's very similar, you know. In consciousness, we have different activities that produce a particular feeling, right? And those particular activities comes from a previous inclination or a previous kind of habituation pattern or a process. And this habituation pattern or process is not just kind of in certain forms of philosophy. It talks about seeds or potentials, right? And other forms of philosophy, for example, Lama Tsongkhapa's interpretation of one aspect of the great philosopher Arya Nagarjuna talks about the term disintegratedness. That is a term we define as kind of everything that is impermanent, everything that's momentary changing, is in decay every split second, right? It decays and grows and decays and grows. So this disintegrated aspect of reality, of impermanent phenomena as such, is not that when one moment disintegrates and becomes disintegratedness, that moment doesn't vanish as such. Yeah, so we classify that not as matter, that we classify in a group where we associate, as we call it, non-associated composition factors, which is a kind of level of reality that is not consciousness and is not matter, right? So it's not a visible aspect, what we can examine as such with empirical kind of research. But it carries information. It's kind of a process of carrying information of the previous moments, and seed, which produces the plant, and the plant produces the different leaves and the different veins in the plant. That comes from, the seed came from a previous plant, right? And it's not just the disintegration of that previous plant that dies and the seed goes somewhere else, but that information of the previous plant, that disintegratedness, so to say, leaves a potential in the seed, right? So this potential that is left in the seed, you can call it energy, or you can call it the kind of field of energy. That is not well defined in Buddhism. Yeah, we only merely talk about it's a non-associated composition factor in the sense it is not matter, it is not consciousness. So we can see it as a kind of energy, right? Which is not perceivable with sensory perception, and it carries actually information from previous moments until the next. Yeah? So as soon as the disintegration starts of moment one and goes to moment two, at level of moment two, the disintegratedness of moment one is still present. Yeah? It doesn't disappear as such, though it's not matter anymore, it's not form. So that might be, I don't know, but it might be a way of thinking about how information is carried from a previous moment of time into the present, because we talk about space-time. Right? We cannot pinpoint down whatever object you look at. You have to see it in the context of space-time. And if you in a process, as soon as you start to isolate a particular object or part of an object, you're missing out on this process of space-time. And then to understand that process becomes more and more challenging, because if you're taking something out of the process and you don't see the process anymore, then it becomes very difficult to describe this particular phenomena. Yeah, so that might be, it's just a thought about it. It might be a kind of interpretation.
Well, I think that makes total sense to me, and the it's a kind of generic, not detailed explanation, which is fair enough. I mean, it's the Buddha wasn't studying botany and classifying plants like Linnaeus, and most Buddhist monks since then have not been doing that either. But as a general overview of what's happening, it makes complete sense. It makes more sense to me than it might to most scientists, because, as you probably know, one of my ideas in science is of the idea of morphic resonance, which is the idea of a memory in nature. This is not a conventional scientific view. It's treated by some people as a heresy. I see it as a hypothesis. But the hypothesis, which I first proposed 40 years ago, and in fact developed when I was living in South India, and I wrote my first book on this, A New Science of Life, when I was living in Father Bede's ashram in Tamil Nadu. The idea basically is that the so-called laws of nature are not laws outside space and time, but they're habits, and that nature forms habits, and there's a kind of memory within nature. Each species has a kind of collective memory. Every individual draws on that collective memory and contributes to it. So as a plant develops, for example, a foxglove, it's drawing on the memory of foxglove forms from previous foxgloves, a collective memory. And these shape the way its leaves and flowers and fruits develop, and roots. And we too, as humans, have a collective memory, which is a bit like what Jung called the collective unconscious. So there's a kind of a memory principle in nature which leads to the formation of habits, and most things in nature are mostly following habits. And we ourselves are creatures of habit, and most of our mental life is habitual and unconscious. Not all of our mental life, obviously, because we're conscious of some things. But anyway, this general view of habits in nature and of memory that's transferred across time from one organism to another, in fact, collectively from many organisms, is a familiar idea in Eastern thought. I mean, in Hindu philosophy, it's been an accepted idea for a very long time, and Buddhist philosophy shares a lot of this with Hindu philosophy. When I first thought of the idea of morphic resonance, the process by which the past influences the present on the basis of similarity, I was working in Cambridge in the biochemistry department at Cambridge University. And when I started talking about these ideas of morphic resonance, it didn't go over very well with my colleagues in the biochemistry department. Some of my colleagues in philosophy and history were very interested and discussed the idea. But when I took up my job in an agricultural institute in India, and I was working with Indian scientists, and I had discussions with my Hindu colleagues and told them about this idea, none of them had any problems with it at all. They said, oh, that is nothing new in that idea. Ancient rishis have said this thousands of years ago, So I found that they, instantly identified this as a standard feature of Indian philosophy. Whereas in the West, it's treated as utterly shocking, even today, and utterly heretical. But the problem I had with my Hindu colleagues, I said, well, okay, you've got a PhD in plant genetics, I said. This leads to a completely different view of inheritance. If plants are inheriting things through influences across time from past plants, then inheritance can't simply be explained in terms of genes and DNA. And at first they tried to pretend it could, and then I proved to them it couldn't. At first they thought, because they believed the Hindu philosophy, and they also believed what they'd learned when they did their PhD in plant genetics, they must be compatible because the same person believed both. And I tried to point out they weren't really compatible, that if you have a theory of reincarnation, as Hindus put it, or rebirth, the transfer of traits from one life to another isn't encoded in genes, or it'd be very, very hard to explain it in terms of genes. And so then I said to them, well, this would prove that science is radically inadequate. Modern science has got a very inadequate view of inheritance and of causation. I said, why don't you do something about it if you believe the ancient rishis had a better view all that time ago? And of course they didn't do anything about it because they wanted to keep their jobs and get promoted and get papers published in mainstream scientific journals and things. So they just lived with two completely incompatible worldviews, like a kind of emulsion rather than a synthesis. So the problem I had in Cambridge was to get people to take this idea seriously. And the problem I had in India was, in a sense, the same problem. I couldn't get my Indian colleagues to take seriously their own philosophy, or at least apply it to the science they were doing. They wanted to go on with conventional Western science. I hope that the idea of morphic resonance and memory in nature can provide a kind of bridge between these Eastern and Western philosophical views. But one thing I'm interested in, you see, is that my own view is that this collective memory means that we're all influenced by many people in the past, whereas the Hindu view of reincarnation, I know the Buddhist view is different, and that's what I really like to know more about. At least the naive Hindu view, the simple everyday view that ordinary people have, is that you're in one life, you're one person, you die, and then the whole personality is transported over into another body, and you grow up and you were that person in a previous life. And it's like one-to-one, like strings of beads that, the one bead, one life, and it goes over to another. Whereas my own view is much more collective, that there's a kind of collective memory, and we tune in perhaps to some aspects of it rather than others. But it's not that I, Rupert Sheldrake, was a particular person who died in, say, 1930, and that was a particular person who died in 1870, etc., etc. So I personally don't find that view terribly convincing. Now, I know the Buddhist view is different, and I'd love to know what you think about influences being carried over from one life to another in this context.
All right. Yeah. So, I mean, there's two aspects here also you have to maybe think about. We have individual streams of consciousness, and we have a collective form of what we call karma or activity with other beings who have also consciousness, right? So we classify, like, take the earth as an example, human beings and animals possess a particular form of stream of consciousness. And that stream of consciousness is individual as such. It doesn't have a beginning and it doesn't have an end. Because every moment of consciousness can only be produced by consciousness itself. Yeah, a similar cause should create the next moment. So then we come to a kind of infinite kind of recession or infinite kind of moments where there's actually no beginning of the individual streams of consciousness. And as you know, also in Hindu philosophy, it talks about universal consciousness, for example, or you become one with God's consciousness, right? So we have similar aspects in Buddhism, but then it talks about the quality of something, that you get similar qualities as that universal aspect in your individual stream. So that's kind of a differentiation between becoming one with universal consciousness. We say we become a Buddha eventually. That means that we get the same qualities. It's not that our stream of consciousness merges with the stream of another consciousness. That's not the case, but we get the similar qualifications or the similar kind of aspects of consciousness. So that's one aspect of that streams of consciousness are individual. But that doesn't mean there's a correlation between two or billions of beings having similar types of, having individual streams of consciousness, but there's a correlation in for example, the pandemic. You know, that's a kind of example from a Buddhist point of view. Most beings on this planet had the karma, or so to say, the potentials, or we talk about, basically what we talk about is probabilities. Yeah, we have probabilities in our continuity of consciousness created in the past. And it depends on external conditions for one or two or whatever probability to become manifest. So that means that, for example, with the pandemic, take it as an example, most of us have the karma to be within this kind of lockdown or temporarily kind of aspect of the pandemic, right? But there are people, that's our common kind of karma or common cause and effect relationship. Yeah, nothing is random in Buddhism. We have created a cause for this. Otherwise, it doesn't come into being. So that means we have all the probabilities for this to be in the same situation. But we have individual streams of consciousness because some people don't get sick at all. Some people get not even infected. And some people get infected but get not sick. And there are people who are infected and get sick. And among those, there are those who die and not die. So the collective aspect of all this is that we all in the pandemic, but there are individual forms of experience. Yeah, so that actually proves that we have individual streams of consciousness as such. And yeah, that is there since the beginner's lifetime and goes all the way up. As Buddhists, we think we can all the way up go to nirvana or enlightenment if we train the mind, right? We have all these probabilities in our mind. So that means if we get rid of destructive emotions in the kind of process of purification, process of meditation on different aspects of the nature of reality, we can eliminate those kind of probabilities of the negative thoughts or the probabilities of destructive emotions as such. And then the only probabilities are left is kind of virtuous thoughts or virtuous state of mind, which actually produces kind of happiness, right? So that is kind of individual aspect as consciousness as well. So this, we have two. The correlation is not that individual remains individual without connection with other consciousnesses and with the planet and with the sun. There is constant interaction. Nothing is individual as such. That's kind of a process between consciousness, matter, and what we call non-associated composition factors. So that's kind of, or you call it energy. So if you call it morphic resonance, or you call it the implicate order, as David Bohm suggests, there is something there that we cannot see, that is a process or an intrinsic nature that is has to unfold and in order to become manifest, as David Bohm indicates. So that reality is probably there. We see that in your theory, we see that in David Bohm's theory, and we see that across the Buddhist forms of logic or philosophy. But what is actually morphic resonance? What is actually this kind of the quantum potential? They're now examining more in UCL and here in London, as you know. So they will come up with a research very soon, and I'm very interested in their findings, because that might explain a lot more about what is behind all this reality, what appears to us.
Yes, well, thank you. That's a very clear exposition. You have a wonderful gift, Geshe Namdak, for clear exposition. I really appreciate it. Yes, well, the individual differences and the collective, yes, well, you see, I think that the morphic resonance, how it relates to David Bohm's ideas is that it uses quite different terminology, but he and I were quite friendly, and we had some dialogues and discussions about the relationship between his idea of the implicate order. He thought the implicate order was a hidden order which underlies the explicate order, the phenomenal world, the world we experience, and shapes it and orders it. But the implicate order is in many dimensions. It's not in sort of normal three-dimensional space and time. And when I first met David Bohm, he thought of this as a kind of one-way process. The implicate order folds out into the explicate order. And my criticism of that was it was like Platonism in Western philosophy, that there's an eternal realm of forms or ideas that gives rise to the world we live in. But there's no memory in that. And Platonism doesn't have a memory in nature. It has the idea of that everything is governed by an eternal, invisible reality. And because modern science grew up in the 17th century under the influence of Platonic thought, to some degree under the implicit influence of Platonic thought, as refracted through Christian theology, the idea that most scientists in the 17th century had was that, yes, nature is governed by an invisible ordering principle, and those are the laws of nature, which are ideas in the mind of God, and God was thought of as a kind of mathematician, and an eternal mathematician, and therefore these eternal laws were eternal because they were in God's mind, and they were provided the hidden order underlying everything in nature. Now, most modern scientists still believe that, but many of them don't believe in God. So what they've got is basically the ghost of the mind of God, which is still full of invisible ordering principles, the laws of nature, which account for nature as we experience it in the view of conventional science. But without the theological background or any understanding, in fact, they believe these laws are sort of free-floating. And if you ask them, well, where are they? How do they work? They can't answer any of those questions because they haven't thought about it. But it started as a theological conception that was fairly clearly worked out. And it's been degraded into a kind of undiscussed assumption about eternal laws. Now, you see, to start with, David Bohm's implicate order was rather like that. But the challenge for any theory like that is evolution, that if you had any eternal laws, everything would just repeat. And the whole evolutionary view of nature is that it's creative, that there's a appearance of new things in the course of evolution. And also there's a kind of memory, because what's happened before tends to be repeated, and there seem to be habits. So David Bohm then, he modified his theory to say that the explicate order, what happens in the world that we experienced, phenomenal world, feeds back into the implicate order. What he used the word introjection, is fed back or injected back into the implicate order. So the implicate order is building up a kind of memory as time goes on, and so would act as a bearer of memory, and habits would develop within it. Now, my idea of morphic resonance says the same thing, but uses completely different language. My idea is that similar patterns of vibratory activity will influence subsequent similar patterns across space and time, from the past to the present. Now, if you say, why? I just can't say why. I just say, well, that's a postulate, a hypothesis that nature works like this. As David Bohm's postulate or hypothesis was that there's an implicate order with a kind of memory within it. And so, in that sense, David Bohm's idea and my idea are very similar and quite compatible. And his idea forms a kind of bridge with the world of quantum physics. And my ideas form a bridge with the realm of biology and psychology. So in that sense, they're similar. But the big unsolved problem for all these philosophies, possibly for Buddhist philosophy as well, I don't know about that, but the big problem is creativity. And you see, science, conventional science that says all the laws of nature are fixed at the moment of the Big Bang, doesn't have new laws coming into being. They're all supposed to be there at the beginning. They can't explain why, and they can't explain why those laws are like that rather than some other laws. And I can't explain, and David Bohm can't explain the Big Bang either. But the evolutionary view of nature that came through, first through progressivist thought in the 18th century, there was the idea that humans evolve through science. The Enlightenment intellectuals thought that there was an evolution of humanity, but nature didn't evolve. Animals and plants didn't evolve. Only humans evolved. They became better through science, and they thought of Isaac Newton as a kind of god of this humanistic evolutionary worldview. Then Darwin showed, and others showed, that all of biology evolves, not just humans, but human evolution is part of a much wider biological evolutionary process. But physicists said, oh no, the universe doesn't evolve. The universe is actually running down towards a thermodynamic heat death. That was the 19th century view. So biological evolution was a kind of anomaly in a universe that was gradually running out of steam and would eventually freeze up in the heat death. But then in 1966, when Big Bang cosmology became orthodox, we got a view of the entire universe as evolving. And that means that at one time there were no zinc atoms or iron atoms or methane molecules or crystals of salt, and certainly no forms of life at the time of the Big Bang. All these things have evolved in time, that the evolution involves a vast creative process. New things happen that weren't there before. At some time the first eye appeared in an animal, the first feather on a bird, the first human appeared, the first thoughts, human thoughts, the first language appeared in humans. It wasn't human language before that. So in the course of time there's an unfolding of new things. Now, for any philosophy that I know of, creativity is a problem, because most philosophers explain things in terms of what went before. And you can't explain a creative act in terms of what went before unless you say it's not really creative. It had happened before, but it's been forgotten, or it was in another universe. And traditional Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, as I understand them, are cyclical, that they see repeating cycles rather than a creative evolutionary process. And, traditional Western philosophy, Platonic philosophy, didn't see creative evolutionary process either. And so I think that this evolutionary vision that we have in science provides a challenge for all traditional philosophies. I don't know if you agree or not.
Partly, not completely, but so I mean, if we just look at life, if we just look at life on our planet, for example, humans and animals and insects, right? So we say all those different, we classify as sentient beings, meaning beings that has a stream of consciousness. And as I indicated, we have individual streams of consciousness and collective aspects, yeah, that we experience similar things. So the stream of consciousness is there since beginner's lifetime, and that means that since beginner's lifetime, we have done all kind of activities which leaves this kind of probabilities, so to say, or what we call potentials or karmic imprints, as we define it in Buddhism. So this karmic imprints or probabilities within our continuities, that has many possibilities, and even the possibility of creating something completely new that we haven't experienced before, but similar. Yeah, so that means it's not exactly the same, but a similar process can happen. Yeah, and that's the whole law of karma talks about it, that we can be born as a human on a particular planet, but how we look like, the shape of our body, the length, that depends also on external factors. So it means we have these probabilities in our continuity of consciousness to be born as a human being at a planet at a particular time, but it also depends on the factors at that particular time on that planet, meaning what are the conditions in the atmosphere? What are the conditions for sustaining life? And that comes in interaction between the continuity of consciousness as well external factors, and that produces a kind of creativity in one sense of a new being or a human being that looks different than the one you've been before. So it's a kind of a very complex process of individual streams of consciousness. Yeah, so consciousness is not matter. Yeah, and consciousness imprints in this stream of consciousness, right? Which is this disintegratedness, according to one particular very interesting interpretation, which means that nothing is lost. There is no information lost. So that also indicates the possibility of memory, and not only in the continuity of consciousness, but also in the field of matter. Not a memory of a consciousness, but a memory of previous disintegrated aspects that are present at the moment in the form of probabilities. And that also, when those moments of probabilities meet external conditions, then also there can be a new plant coming up, because it depends on the soil, depends on what kind of chemicals there are in the soil to develop. So it's a kind of, like what David Bohm says, the implicate and explicit order is not that two different kind of realities. It's a constant flux, and what do you say, it re-injects in the implicate order. It's memory, so to say, or it's disintegratedness, right? So it's a flux of becoming more manifest, and because the flux of becoming more manifest or becoming more dormant, because there's different levels of reality, and the information that is stored, or the memory, if you want to call it, that is stored, is this disintegratedness of previous moments, right? And that is not classified as matter or as consciousness, but it interacts with those two, and it interacts with external conditions as well. So that gives an opportunity for us to develop or have this kind of creativity of new plants we haven't seen before, or human beings developing in a different way, though similar, but different outlook than previous forms of human beings, for example.
Yes, well, that's I think a fairly plausible way of dealing with it, because I mean the idea of probabilities, of course, is standard in modern science. I mean, it's interesting that this is part of the Buddhist approach, because probability is the very basis of quantum theory, and indeed practically everything else in science. In the 19th century, people thought that everything was predictable and completely fixed. And now we recognize that through quantum theory, through chaos and complexity theory, that actually practically everything is probabilistic. Certainly in biology, it's all probabilistic. When you look at a leaf and you look at the vein pattern on the leaf, there's a roughly similar veins, but even on two sides of the same leaf, the veins have a different pattern. And on every leaf of the same tree with the same genetics, they're different. So I think that general approach is actually supported very strongly by conventional science. And today, also the idea that it interacts with different situations which change in different planets and different climates and different eras. That also makes great sense. So what I would conclude from what you've just said is that within the Buddhist philosophy there's the potential for creativity, for new kinds of plants and people and ideas and so on. But in the past, I imagine Buddhist philosophers didn't place much emphasis on this. The potential was there, but Buddhism didn't come up with Darwin's theory of evolution or the Big Bang theory of cosmology, and neither did Christian theology, or neither did within science itself. It was an evolutionary process that this evolutionary view emerged. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying within the Buddhist philosophy there's the potential for creativity, and indeed this can be realized. Creativity doesn't pose a challenge to the basic foundations of the philosophy, but in the past Buddhist philosophers didn't emphasize this because they had no need to, because it wasn't a big issue, whereas in an evolutionary cosmology it's a very big issue. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, that's correct, because what I say, like also with language, we have to be careful, because when I talk about probabilities, we have different terminology within the Buddhist context of philosophy, right? We talk about karmic imprints, so to say, but it's a similar kind of approach. Yeah? It's a similar kind of approach in the sense that there are all these possible different types of karmic imprints, and it depends on external conditions for it to come to ripening or not. So we're talking about probabilities, right?
Yes.
And then in a similar way, with Darwin's theory of evolution, it can be completely explained to a certain extent. That species develop over time, although they have individual streams of consciousness, but they have these probabilities of being born in this particular place on the planet and develop in this particular way because of the temperature on the planet, or because of the different external factors of the food that is needed to come about. So there is a development, an external one, but that depends on the internal beings who have carried this continuity of consciousness. Otherwise, the development will not happen. So there's constantly a correlation in creativity in this case. We can fully support from this stream of consciousness with the probabilities, and then depending on the causes and conditions externally, like climate, etc., for being to develop in a particular way, right? So that's like Darwin's theory, we can completely accept in the sense of different types of consciousness. They take what we call rebirth in the form of these kind of creatures, because at that particular time on this planet, in this kind of space-time kind of event, then the causes and conditions are such that this being develops in a particular way. Yeah, so that falls quite well in the philosophy behind it. Yeah.
Well, I think it would be very interesting I don't know if there's anywhere in the world where people who are Buddhists are trying to do science in a different way, because it would lead to very different predictions. For example, I think on the basis of morphic resonance that our memories are not stored as physical traces in our brains. I think memories are resonance, and the reason we have our own memories is because we're more similar to ourselves in the past than we are to anyone else. And on the basis of similarity, our memories are caused by a kind of resonance across time. The standard materialist view of memory is that everything we remember is because of some modified nerve ending or RNA molecule or some physical memory trace inside the brain. And of course, people who believe that materialist view believe that when you die, the brain decomposes, all your memories are wiped out, and that's it. There's no possibility either of reincarnation, rebirth, transfer into a collective unconscious, or anything else, because it's all just matter inside the brain. Now, presumably the Buddhist view would be more that memories work not just as matter inside the brain. They interact with the brain, but they're not in it. And so if there were a Buddhist university with Buddhist neuroscientists, then I'd love to see a Buddhist university with Buddhist neuroscientists doing research on memory going beyond the materialist theory. Unfortunately, science is a kind of tyranny at the moment in all countries. Whatever people's philosophy, they will do the same kind of science. And, you know, but it would be wonderful to think that in Tibet or in Thailand or in Sri Lanka or in some Buddhist country that there would be a Buddhist university doing science in a completely different way. Do you think that would ever happen, or do you see Buddhist ideas somehow influencing scientists to do science differently? I mean, it would be very exciting if they did, in my view, but have you ever seen any evidence of this happening?
It's not that it will happen, it already happened, right? Because we have a lot of research being done between the correlation of consciousness and brain activity. Yeah, so Richard Davidson, for example, is one of probably the world leading experts in the field of what effects does our consciousness, in particular, with regards to mental state of meditators, how does that influence the brain? Yeah? And also in the fields of for example, obsessive compulsive disorder, there's a lot of research being done between the correlation of consciousness, what we call consciousness, and the physical brain. Yeah, there's a correlation, but is that correlation causal? And so how does consciousness produce a particular brain activity, or does brain activity produce a particular state of consciousness? And both ways of traffic is possible. If you have, for example, a severe OCD issue, then the brain tells you what to do. You're not in control. But if you train your mind in what Jeffrey Schwartz, for example, a very interesting personality in the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder, he uses kind of Buddhist techniques of what he calls the power of mental force or mental activity or kind of mindfulness training to teach the patients to think about something else at the time the brains tell you to do something else. Over time, if you train well, then consciousness actually produces the brain, right? Produce brain's activity. So that causality is two-way traffic. Mm. So that's definitely there. And then with regards to other forms of science that proves that consciousness is not a brain, if we follow, for example, the near-death experience, when there's a clinical cardiac arrest without 10 to 20 seconds, the oxygen flow to the brain stops and the brain is dead, right? According to our neuroscientific interpretation. But there is perception at that time. Mm. And to a certain, depends which kind of research you depend upon. If you think about Bruce Grayson, one of the, in America, the psychiatrist who did a lot of research regarding near-death experience, and he came to figures of 90% of people perceive is accurate. Well, the brain is dead. So that is basically evidence. That is scientific evidence. And of course, we have different research about children remembering previous lifetimes by Professor Stevenson from the University of Virginia and his student Jim Tucker, that proves, that's very interesting to see, because Stevenson didn't say, I'm proving reincarnation. He says, but it's very interesting, he says there's something that carries the information from a previous personality to the present. It's very interesting. But we call in Buddhism the continuity of consciousness, right? And then a more newer field to develop in the Buddhist culture or within the Buddhist society in relation with neuroscience is what we call the Tukdam, or the clear light mind of death meditation, which we only have up till now documented, or we have data of about 13 cases only, because it's very rare event. That means a person is clinically dead, has practiced in this life. This mostly happens with accomplished masters, and they stay in the clear light mind of death for a week, 2 weeks, and just last April, we had one in Gyume Tantric College who stayed for 37 days in this clear light, which means that there's no decomposition, no decay of the body, though there's no heartbeat and no lung function. So according to the present findings, there's nothing measurable with EEG they have measured of brain activity as such. So from the Buddhist point of view, we say in the Vajrayana kind of explanation of these points, that consciousness is still present, but in a very subtle level. That means coarser forms of consciousness, especially sensory perception, they correlate with the brain, they need the brain to function. But there are states of consciousness, the more subtle you get, the less dependence on the brain is needed. Like, for example, in the near-death experience. As we see, there's perception, and the perception is validated, and certain research that prove 90% is valid. And then in this near-death experience, in this event of the Tudam, or the clear light mind meditations, the doctors, they consider this person is clinically dead. There's no heartbeat, no lung function, but there's no decay of the body. So then the question is, how do we explain this? And then from the Buddhist point of view, we say there's a very subtle consciousness present in the body, which stops the decay. And when that subtle consciousness doesn't need the brain to function, and there's some accomplished masters, they meditate on the ultimate nature of reality at the time. But when the consciousness then leaves the body, there's different signs to be seen, then the body starts decaying. So it's a very interesting aspect already, quite some research already started in these lines, but yeah, much more is needed, of course. Yeah. Will be very interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Well, very good. That was a very good summary of this field of research. I think you're right, actually. These areas of research they're changing our view of consciousness, and what was regarded as merely anecdotal in the past is now being properly and rigorously investigated. But by too few people. I mean, I know Bruce Grayson, and I knew Professor Stevenson. And in Holland, I know Pim van Lommel, who's done very good studies on near-death experiences in much more rigorous conditions, because he's a cardiologist, than in accidents and heart attacks. Under controlled hospital conditions, you can observe the details much more. No, so I think you're right, actually, that these things are opening up. But I look forward to the day when, instead of just 3 or 4 centers in Western countries, in Buddhist countries like Japan, Thailand, etc., and possibly China too, people start, if it were done on a larger scale, there's more motive for Buddhists to do this than people who come. In the West, many scientists are materialists, and many of them atheists, and would be opposed to this research. But in Buddhist countries, it would be perhaps easier to open the doors as time goes on for this research. And it's obviously not only interesting scientifically, but it's of enormous interest to millions of people because it's relevant to our human lives, much more relevant than most of the research that goes on in scientific laboratories today. So I've just noticed the time. We've gone beyond our allocated time.
Just want to because there are this kind of research already going on in the monasteries itself, right? In my own monastery, Sera Jey, we have a science department which, has a lot of kind of relationships with university in the West, and they do a lot of kind of research regarding, brain activity as such. So it is developing, right? It just needs some more time and funding and effort. Yeah. So that's but it's still time because we'll be given 9 questions. And we didn't even go to one of them. So,
well, thank you. Well, I'm delighted to hear it's happening in monasteries as well. I didn't know that. Very, very pleased to hear that.
Yeah, so that was an extraordinary conversation, and I didn't expect us to go beyond the first question either. So we'd like to open it up, though, now to the audience. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand using that reaction function on Zoom, if you have them. And actually, if there aren't any, I can easily start with one, because I'm very curious. You've talked about that there can be a continuity of form or habits explained through either karma or morphic resonance, but there are these moments in the origins of life that are as profound as the Big Bang, right? The moment when the rocky Earth suddenly has a self-replicating organism. And also, how is the potential within the first self-replicating organism with a simple, binary genetic code capable of evolving towards a human being who can make iPhones and spacecraft and Buddhist monasteries and so on? You touched on that a little bit, the creative principle, but especially those, it's that those particular binary moments from rocky planet to living life, and then from simple life to the extraordinary complexity of our human minds and behavior. Is it possible to touch on those questions very briefly?
You can. I mean, from the point of view of continuity, we have to be clear that the materialistic world or matter as such, and the continuity of consciousness within the continuity of sentient beings. There's two different things, right? Though they interact with each other, but it's two different things. So that means that a being having consciousness comes from a previous moment of consciousness, and the previous moments come from previous moments. And what kind of being that is going to be developed depends on this kind of karma or these probabilities within the continuum of that particular being, right? So it is different from the involvement of creation of matter as such. Yeah. Although there's also the disintegrated aspects of previous moments, which carries the information throughout space-time. Yeah. When one particular planet like Earth, starts to explode or whatsoever, if we heat up the Earth a little bit more and it starts to burn everywhere, then the human beings and those who have consciousness, they slowly will die out, right? And be born in other places in the universe, because there's much other places with life as well. So that means that the particular Earth will disintegrate, and in the future, the same kind of continuity of matter, because of the probabilities, when it meets external conditions, it can create a kind of new planet, or maybe climate change happens again. And so, you have to be distinction between the continuity of the consciousness within sentient beings and the mere matter in the materialistic world, so to say, although there's a correlation between the two. Yeah.
And Dr. Sheldrake, what would be your perspective on this question?
Well, that was a really interesting answer. I take the view that the normal discussion of the origin of life is the materialist framework is taken for granted, that here's this entire unconscious universe, stars, galaxies, planets, rock, totally unconscious, totally dead, and then miraculously or by chance, here on Earth, the first life appears and has the potential to become us. Well, a bit like Geshe Namdak, I don't really accept that view that the whole universe is totally unconscious to start with. And like Geshe Namdak, I think that if there are other planets where life has already evolved, then by morphic resonance there could be influences to this planet, and evolution on this planet could be shaped by influences from others. But that pushes the problem back to other planets and other forms of life. And you could argue that given the Big Bang theory of the universe, at one stage there were no planets. So the Big Bang was billions of degrees centigrade. There was not even atoms. It was too hot for atoms or even plasma. So there must have been the first life somewhere, even if it wasn't here. But I don't take the view that the whole universe is unconscious, you see. I think that if we take the view that the entire universe might have a kind of mind or consciousness, and a galaxy might have a mind or consciousness, a solar system might have a mind or consciousness, a planet might have a mind or consciousness, and therefore when the first life appears on that planet, it's not as if consciousness has come from nowhere, from total unconsciousness, but it's coming into being within a larger, more coherent conscious system, and which may play a role, a creative role, in the emergence of life within it. So in the case of the Earth, if we take the view that Gaia, the Earth, is a living organism, that there was a kind of not just rock, but also oceans and swirling currents and clouds and atmosphere, and hydrothermal vents and clay that sort of dried up and then during the seasons and got wet again, all sorts of changing conditions that might have allowed for the emergence of life within Gaia, that the mind of Gaia may have played a role in that emergence of life. We don't necessarily have to explain it in terms of a bottom-up emergence from mere inorganic or simple organic chemicals to more complex ones. The usual view is this bottom-up view. But actually, even within modern physics, there's a top-down view. I mean, the gravitational field is a top-down field that includes everything in the universe. It doesn't emerge gradually from bottom up from particles of matter. It's there from the beginning. And according to superstring theory, there was an initial unified field of all nature with 10 dimensions, or 11 in brain theory or M theory. And these underwent a kind of splitting. These fields of nature split up, gravity separated from electromagnetism, but originally it was one combined field. And these top-down fields have shaped the universe from the large to the small, so it's not all from the small to the large. And if these overarching organizing fields have a conscious element to them, then we have a kind of interaction between the small and the large, which puts that problem in a different light. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't give us any sense of detail as to how the first life happened. But it suggests that we don't necessarily have to look for the origin of life in purely blind inorganic matter and random collisions of atoms.
We have a question from Alexander. Would you like to ask your question? Unmute.
Yes, hello there, both respected speakers. Thank you so much. Love, love, love from both, your hearts. You can really feel the consciousness coming through. So that's first and foremost. But my question is about changelessness and beginninglessness, to try to follow up on Scott's question. My question is, if the universe is expanding, then what is it expanding against?
Very interesting. I mean, basically, when we think about beginningless time, right, our consciousness is there since beginningless time. Why? Because within the stream of consciousness, we cannot really find a beginning as such. Because every moment of consciousness is being preceded by a previous moment. Right? Then when you talk about the universe, then the universe doesn't have an end. Yeah, we live in a particular galaxy. In a similar way, a particular Big Bang happens in one part of this endless universe. That doesn't mean there are Big Bangs in other parts of the universe, most properly. Right? So the universe doesn't have an end. There's no border as such. So it's infinite space, right? So that does in a certain way implies that within that infinite space, and then time and space taking into example, then one Big Bang in one part of this infinite space influence another Big Bang in another part of this infinite space. And then we have the correlation between planets and correlation between different kind of universe systems, yeah, because it's all part of the whole. So going back to the universe as consciousness, or these planets have consciousness, but if there's an interaction of this process of different moments in time, in space-time, then with these probabilities, of course, an effect relationship, it depends upon external factors in order to develop in a particular planet as such. And so that is what we mostly probably interpreted from the Buddhist point of view. But then on top of that, how an earth develops also depends on the karma or the collective karma of the sentient beings that are actually living in that particular planet. And so if we take our planet Earth as an example, to have the temperature right, as we have at the moment, if you see how many factors are needed for the temperature, the distance of the sun and the distance of other planets, gravity, and you know, the many aspects of the weather patterns, to get it all right is very, very difficult. If you see all the variables that are needed to get it right for human life to evolve, right, then we need a particular kind of cause and effect relationships of the beings that live on this particular planet. So that's the correlation between individual streams of consciousness and the potentials in those streams of consciousness, of the probabilities of living in a place like this, and the external involvement of planets like our own planet Earth. Yeah, maybe.
Well, that's an astonishing vision. I don't have much to add, except to say that the idea of the idea of space and time, the philosophical discussion of them and the universe goes back a long way. And in the West, one of the philosophers who thought about this was St. Augustine. And he pointed out that space and time come into being with the universe. It's not that the universe comes into being within space and time. Space and time come into being with the universe. So if the universe expands, there's no point of view that any of us could possibly have that's outside it. We're always inside it. And mathematicians, if you say, well, how can it be expanding? What's it expanding into? Then they say, well, it's bounded. It's infinite but bounded. And then you start asking, what does that mean? And they then blind you with mathematics and talk about extra dimensions and so on. Well, I can't follow all those extra dimensions. I'm easily blinded by mathematics, and I sort of tune out at that point. So I suspect it would be possible to give an answer to this question which would blind us all with mathematics, but I'm not capable of doing it. So I can't say I lose any sleep about the question of what it's expanding into, because the universe we actually live in has a light horizon. The universe is larger than we can ever know, because light travels at a finite speed, and there's a limit to how far we can possibly see or observe. I think once we sort of get beyond all these limits, we're in the realms of pure speculation, where we're not actually finding out much about the universe, we're just finding out about our own minds and the way we think.
Barbara has a question. Barbara, you can unmute. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, Josh, Barbara, hi.
Hi.
I think Barbara.
Sorry.
Other Barbara. Sorry, you can come next to Barbara.
Yeah, well, first of all, like Alexander, I really appreciate the discussions. It's really excellent. I've had the opportunity to see both of you in the past in the flesh, and hopefully in the not too distant future that might happen again. Yeah, but Rupert, if I would like to ask you, I'm not sure that I've heard it, about you and the Christian view of reincarnation, because I think we spoke more about the Buddhist perspective. And then Geshe, I was wondering if there's time, would you be able to speak just a little about the clear light of death meditation? I have a fascination on meditating on death and bringing death more to life as I think about it. That was two questions, really, if that's okay.
Oh, all right. Well, I'll try and say something about, if we're talking, I mean, obviously the central feature of Christianity is Christ. I mean, that's why it's named Christianity. And one of the central points is that Jesus Christ in his human existence combined both being a human and a divine consciousness. And a lot of Christian theology is concerned with trying to work out what that can possibly mean. And there are two main schools of thought within Christian theology right from the beginning. In the Gospels, there are four Gospels, of course, and in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the view of Christ is sometimes discussed as ascending Christology. Jesus Christ is born a human being, and through his personal development, his baptism, his revelation at the moment of his baptism through a kind of mystical unity with God and the ultimate reality, and through his life and through his death and passing beyond death, he becomes one with God. So a human consciousness becomes one with divine consciousness. St. John's Gospel has a different view, descending Christology. Divine consciousness descends into a human being and takes an incarnation in human form. And Jesus is right from before before he becomes a teacher and all that kind of thing. God has descended into human form, and God becomes man. And the other view is man becomes God. And then, of course, there are people who say, well, why has it got to be one or the other? Why can't it be both? I don't think there's a single answer to this, but I think that the whole point is that Jesus takes on this divine consciousness as a human being. And the Christian doctrine of the death and resurrection of Jesus is that he passes through death his body disappears. Some people say, well, isn't this a bit like the rainbow body? You know, he disappears, and then he appears to his disciples, and he appears to people in their dreams and in visions, as he appeared to St. Paul in a vision. That this he continues to live in a way that's accessible to people through their consciousness, through their dreams, through visionary experiences, and through a kind of personal relationship. And he continues to act as a kind of interface between the divine and the human realms. So that seems to me that's what makes sense to me anyway, as a way of understanding it. And of course, the doctrine of the Incarnation is surrounded by various mythic elements. The idea that the Virgin Mary was an intact virgin, etc., seems to me a mythic element rather than necessarily literal truth. And I think its mythic power is really underlies a potential which in the Orthodox and Roman Catholic worlds has been developed through the idea of Mary as Mother of God. It's a way of assimilating the feminine principle, and the great Mother Goddess of the ancient world didn't need men in order to conceive. She was so powerful, the Mother Goddess, she could give birth without males being around. So in a sense it's a kind of proto-feminist principle rather than a blushing, shy, virgin who's afraid of sex and stuff. So, I mean, there's all sorts of ways one can interpret this. And of course, Buddhist stories about elephants and virgin births and so on have mythical elements as well. So I think all religions collect a lot of mythic elements, but my view of the Incarnation would be roughly along those lines I've tried to summarize.
All right, and clear light mind. Yeah, you need a little bit more time. But so what happens at the time of death is very similar what happens when we fall asleep, right? The sensory perceptions, they cease to exist. And the mind becomes what we call mental consciousness remains. So it's very similar to falling asleep. As you know, if you fall asleep slowly, you feel your body sometimes sinking and the sound stops, right? So at that time, only mental consciousness is left. Sensory perception stops. So mental consciousness also has coarser forms and subtler forms. And by the power of meditation, you can make subtler types of consciousness or states of consciousness, you can make manifest in the waking state, normally when people practice. The more you habituate to that particular subtle state of consciousness, then you will be able to recognize it at the time of death when it comes by the power of dying, that consciousness becomes manifest. So an ordinary person will not recognize it, although in the near-death experience events, as also one of my favorite authors and scientists behind this, also Pim van Lommel, it's very interesting to see the research behind it and what people actually see, right? Not only visions, but also actually perception that is valid. Yeah. So that it's happening with a consciousness, what we call mental consciousness. It's not the clear light of mind yet at that moment, but it's a very subtle one. Yeah. So a clear light mind of that meditation means that when all the sensory perception stops and mental consciousness becomes to its most subtle level just before it leaves this body and goes to another birth, right? So at that moment we talk about, or just when you fall asleep, just before the dream starts, we talk about a subtle moment of consciousness. So accomplished practitioners, they can use it to the extent to achieve enlightenment there or in the next point of the bardo, right? So then, to go back to Dr. Sheldrake's interpretation of human becomes God and God becomes human, in Buddhism we have something very similar. If you have achieved enlightenment, by being a human first, achieve enlightenment, so the human becomes a Buddha, then in order to benefit others, the Buddha shows an emanation and takes the aspect of being born somewhere. So then the God or the Buddha becomes human again in order to help society, right? So it all happens from the point of view of this subtle moment of consciousness just before it leaves the body, and that continuity always remains. And there's a continuity also very interesting or important to know. It's also always a non-duality of the most subtle mind with the most subtle energy, which proves that we can establish in a future life not only a mind, but also a body. And in this continuity of the mere subtle mind and energy, there are all these potentials or these kind of probabilities are also present, which causes us, depending on the power of prayer or depending merely on these probabilities, where we are born, how we are born, and how we develop. Yeah. Yeah, is that okay for the time being, Barbara?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you to both of you.
Roy Gillette has a question, if you'd like to unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a wonderful day, wonderful evening. In fact, Geshe, thank you so much for what you just said, because it virtually sort of takes most of my question. It's this idea of the continuation of consciousness that we were grappling with through the conversation earlier. And I've always thought that at the time you die, the state of mind you're in is something that you grasp onto, that carries you forward to another incarnation. If you take an idea of reincarnation, most religions see the moment of death as very important. The Catholic religion, you have to take a particular sort of forgiveness of sins at that moment of time, you know, absolution. And so it's the state of mind you die in that is the grasping that's left. I mean, Geshe has described the ideal way to die and the enlightened way to die. But for most of us, it's that grasping, that regret at the point of death. And then that drags you forward to be wanting to be born at a certain point of space and time at a future incarnation, to work out more of this negativity that's left in this grasping that died in the previous incarnation. And that's how, for me, the continuation of consciousness happens.
So, I mean, it's definitely true. And it's not only in the Buddhist tradition, as you know, many traditions. It talks about the moments of dying, or the consciousness at the moment of dying. The way you're thinking or what kind of emotions are coming up is very crucial for your future existence. And that talks about these probabilities, right? We have a lot of probabilities, either because one part of the planet or another planet, or there's so many probabilities there. So that means when your consciousness thinks about something positive, or you want to benefit others, right? In this particular planet, and you want to have a good education and help others the best way you can, at the moment you're dying and you have that state of mind, it will activate these probabilities. It's a law of cause and effect, nothing else. There's no creator as such who is in charge. It's just the continuations of probabilities that gets activated by a particular way of thinking. So that means that at the time of death, when you think in a positive particular way, may I be born there and there, because I want to help sentient beings to develop in science and to make a correlation with philosophy and let people generate more constructive emotions and eliminate destructive ones. Yeah, if you have that kind of state of mind when you die, it activates these kind of probabilities, which causes this kind of stream of consciousness to be born in a place and time that is according to your wishes, more or less, right? Or according to the previous inclinations or the previous imprints or the previous created probabilities. Yeah.
Dr. Sheldrake, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
It's a pretty good explanation. Josh Barber, I think you have a question.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, Barbara, for interrupting you earlier, and thank you both for a very fascinating discussion. I just had a couple of questions. One was on the question of evolution, the evolution of life and the evolution of the whole universe, and to what extent each of you see that as progressing towards some kind of ultimate end, and in which case, what is that, and is that a point of difference between you or a point of similarity between you? And the other question was to do with Rupert's Trinitarian view of ultimate reality as a Christian, and wondering whether you see a relationship or correlation between that and the Buddhist idea of three kayas.
Okay, well, I don't know whether it's correlated with the three kayas because I don't know enough about Buddhism. So I'm really interested to hear what Geshe Namdak says about that. In terms of evolution, what is it evolving towards? I think this is one of the ultimate mysteries. And, you know, there are people like the philosopher Teilhard de Chardin who have the idea that the evolutionary process is moving towards some higher level of consciousness in which human consciousness plays a particularly important role, not just on this earth, but in terms of the whole universe. Now, exactly how that would work, I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. And right now, our scientific worldview is so limited that what happens in human consciousness here on Earth is entirely a provincial affair confined to the Earth, with no influence on anything else, except insofar as we might send the odd rocket to Mars or something and make a dint on the surface of Mars. But it's not going to affect stars in the rest of our own galaxy or galaxies anywhere else in the universe. The materialist view, of course, is that consciousness is confined to our brains. And so we need to expand our view of consciousness and the interrelation of consciousness, not just within our own planet, but what if there are other planets like the Earth in other star systems? Could it be that our human consciousness could in some way relate to theirs? How could it happen? Well, it's not going to happen through radio signals, too slow. It could only happen through some kind of interplanetary telepathy. But when you look at the number of people in the world researching in telepathy, I'm one of them, but there's about 12 people in the world doing research on telepathy. Most universities won't touch the subject with a barge pole. So it's not as if we're on the threshold of some great breakthrough in interplanetary telepathic communication. We know very little about the potential for it's connecting us up with other forms of consciousness. And we know very little about the way in which our connection with the divine consciousness or with ultimate consciousness would influence the rest of the universe. It's not easy to see from any traditional religious perspective, which misses out the rest of the universe as discovered by modern science, why you need billions of galaxies, each one with billions of stars. Because most religions portray this as a drama going on between us and ultimate consciousness or God. So what's the rest of the universe got to do with it? It's a big mystery, and I think that no traditional theological system has really had to deal with that question. I mean, the Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies, well, the Hindus spend more time on cosmology, and Buddhists slightly discouraged it. Do have these vast cycles of universes and a vast conception of the universe, much greater than anyone had in the West until very recently. Exactly how our consciousness relates to all that is, in my view, something we just simply don't know. And so I could speculate, but I hardly know how to speculate about it. It's such a vast question.
All right. So, I mean, 2 points to your question, right? Or 2 questions, so to say. So, one aspect of when things come to an end, right, that the whole universe or the stream of consciousness doesn't come to an end. But within the whole universe, there are individual planets or whatsoever that comes to an end. But the universe in the infinite aspect, there's no end to that. And that is also true for the stream of consciousness. Yeah, there's no end to consciousness at all. There's no beginning and there's no end in the individual streams of consciousness. Although there is an end to the what we call contaminated streams of consciousness. Yeah, to come to the next part of your question, that means that if you eliminate all faults, as we have, or all destructive emotions together with their potentials or together with their probabilities, if you eliminate those aspects of the consciousness, then a pure consciousness remains, right? And then, of course, it's a little bit more complicated than what I'm explaining now, but that gives you an idea that the stream of consciousness doesn't stop, but the contaminated aspect, as we have at the moment, that can stop. Yeah, we can purify our mind, eliminate all destructive emotions like anger, attachment, not understanding reality, right? So then you develop your mind that you completely understand reality, yeah, or what we call omniscience, or the omniscient mind of a Buddha. And as I just indicated in the answer to Barbara's question, that the most subtle forms of consciousness have been explained in the Vajrayana, and also in the Kala Chakra Tantra, or the Wheel of Time. It talks about the relation of our being and the cosmos and the different aspects of reality in the different planets, etc. But to come back to that stream of consciousness that has this kind of subtle stream of consciousness that goes from this life to the next, and that goes together in a non-duality with the most subtle energy, right? So that means that can produce a consciousness in the future as well as a form aspect. That's why we have the human body, and we have, you know, in the Hindu philosophy, we talk about name and form. In Buddhism also, we talk about name and form, right? Meaning consciousness as well as physical body. So at the time when you develop this consciousness to the full extent, meaning you have eliminated all its faults, and you have accomplished all the qualities, and you generate this kind of omniscience mind, then you become a Buddha with your consciousness, or you achieve what we called the Dharmakaya, right? Or the truth body of the Buddha. And because you have the non-duality with the subtle energies, which creates the form bodies of the Buddha, right? So we have the Ambhogakaya and the Nirmanakaya, right? So that stream of consciousness in the most purified form with the stream of this most subtle energy creates this kind of, in the future, if the right cause and conditions are present, creates this kind of bodies or the three kayas of a Buddha, so to say. But that doesn't say that consciousness stops at that time. Consciousness remains, but is at that time a pure form of consciousness without any faults or without any misunderstandings of reality. At that time, the things we talk about now, and for many of these aspects, we completely, I mean, maybe not completely, but for a vast majority of what we discuss here, we don't really know what's going on, right? So if you have this omniscience kind of consciousness being developed over, we talk about eons, which is a very long period of time of development, but eventually on the spiritual ladder or spiritual progress, it's possible. And then, then if we have a person like that here in the audience, then he or she will be able to give us all the answers we were asking each other. Yeah.
Okay, is anyone in the audience enlightened and want to answer that question? We have time for one more question from Anais, and then we'll wrap up.
Hello, thank you very much. First of all, to both, well, actually to all of you. I'm finding it hard to make the question in my mind, so I'm just gonna drop it to see if it makes any sense. So Geshe Tenzin Namdak, I would like to ask you about your views in emptiness and interdependence. So I'm fascinated by the Buddhist concept of emptiness and interdependence, and I'm also a little bit familiar with, of course, on a really superficial level, to modern physics, so to quantum physics, and I think that. But both emptiness and interdependence can be explained in a really amazing way from the modern physics point of view when we correlate them. So I was wondering if you can share some of your views in this matter with us, please. Thank you very much.
So, I mean, thank you for the question, but there will be another dialogue, I'm afraid, because emptiness and dependent origination, I cannot explain within 1 or 2 minutes, right? So, but to summarize, meaning it's two sides of a coin. Yeah, I started today with explaining conventional reality and ultimate reality. That means the conventional reality is the interdependence among the different aspects of reality, meaning parts and a collection of parts, or cause and effect, and being merely imputed by the mind. So those three levels of interdependence prove the ultimate nature of reality, which is emptiness. So emptiness is not nothingness. Emptiness means an absence of something that is not there. And that mere vacuum, or that mere absence, that we call emptiness. So what is that? Meaning empty of inherent existence. That nothing exists independent all by itself. That does not exist. So everything is empty of that aspect. You see that? So as this room is empty of an elephant, that in a similar way, the Zoom, the screen, our body, our mind is empty of inherent existence. There is no inherent existence in the sense of an independent entity of body and mind. That doesn't exist. So we say it's empty of that, right? So that's kind of, in short, what we call emptiness. But if you're interested, very auspicious, because tomorrow we're going to start with Nagarjuna's philosophy here in Jamyang, and that will go on for quite a few Wednesday evenings, and that will go in depth in these kind of points of ultimate nature of reality and dependent origination, according to the philosophy of Arya Nagarjuna, who is being considered as the most superior philosophers of ancient India when it comes to these aspects of reality. Yeah. So it'll take some more time to sink in. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything else to add, Dr. Sheldrake, before we wrap up?
No, that was a wonderful explanation.
Thank you. Well, it's been a privilege having you two incredible beings speak with each other. I really benefited a lot, and I'll hand it over now to Saida and Marco to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks once again to Dr. Sheldrake and to Geshe Namdak. And thank you, Scott, as usual, for your skillful moderation. We are going to quickly share our screen to say thank you to the amazing team of Jamyang Buddhist Centre and the amazing team of volunteers of Science and Wisdom Live, and also to our partner, Mind and Life Europe. And we're also very happy to make a couple of announcements regarding upcoming events.
Yeah, so the first is our upcoming online event, which is called Healing the Body, Healing the Mind. So this is a weekend full of talks, workshops, and teachings on the mind-body connection in collaboration with Jamyang Buddhist Centre and also with Land of Medicine Buddha in the US. So this event is free of charge and it's in June. So if you would like to join us, it would be absolutely wonderful. We also have a new podcast coming up, which is a podcast interview with Jason Upton, who's a UPCP registered existential psychotherapist and also senior lecturer at Regent's University. And he has practiced Tibetan movement practices for over 17 years, which he actually talks to us about in the podcast, amongst others about the importance of embodiment and how to become embodied again after COVID. And lastly, as you might know, we are also in the middle of our fundraising campaign, 21 for 2021. So if you are enjoying our talks, dialogues, and podcast interviews, and you're in a position to do so, please consider becoming a patron of Science and Wisdom Live or make a smaller donation. So if you go to our website, www.sciwislife.com, you'll see that there's a link there to our crowdfunding page at the bottom of our homepage.
And finally, we are going to have more online talks, podcast interviews, online dialogues, and science days. And if you would like to get occasional updates on our future events, please follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter. And all our events will be available free of charge on our podcast and YouTube channel. So please sign up on our website, sawislive.com.